Christmas trees seem like the easiest crop in agriculture. Buy a patch of land, stick a few thousand seedlings in the ground, walk away, come back in a few years to a forest that basically sells itself every December. No irrigation drama, no delicate fruit, no daily milking. Just wait for the snow to fall and the checks to arrive. Here's what that picture leaves out. A Christmas tree takes 8 to 10 years to grow. Whatever price you're imagining right now, whatever shortage or glut is making headlines this December, has nothing to do with the trees you'd plant today. Those trees are answering a question about the world in 2036. You won't find out if you guessed right until it's far too late to guess again. So, who can actually get into this business? On paper, almost anyone with a few acres. In practice, the math is stacked in a way that only rewards people willing to wait a decade for their first payday. Start with the land itself, because that's the first number that scares most people off. Rural acreage suitable for tree farming runs anywhere from $1,000 to $4,000 an acre, and that's before you get anywhere near a desirable location. Prime land can run past $10,000 an acre, and you don't need 1 acre. You need enough acres planted at the right density to make the eventual harvest worth the wait. Growers typically plant somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 trees per acre, which sounds like a lot until you remember that not all of them survive, and none of them are worth anything for the better part of a decade. Then there's the equipment, and this is where the business starts looking less like gardening and more like industrial agriculture. You'll want soil testing and amendments before anything goes in the ground. That's another $100 to $500 per acre just to get the dirt ready. Irrigation, if you need it, adds $2,500 to $3,000. Then the hardware, a tractor in the $15,000 to $30,000 range, sprayers running $1,000 to $2,000, and a tree baler at $2,000 to $3,500. That's the machine that wraps a cut tree tight enough to fit on a truck. None of this is optional. All of it sits there depreciating for years before a single tree pays for it. And then there's the cost nobody puts in the brochure, the 8-year hole in your income. In that first year, crop input costs alone can swallow roughly half of whatever revenue trickles in. And there isn't much revenue to swallow, because there's nothing to sell yet. You're paying labor, fertilizer, pest control, insurance, and land costs every single year for the better part of a decade, against zero harvest. That's the real barrier to entry. It was never the land price or the tractor. It's the fact that you have to fund 8 to 10 years of expenses before you learn whether any of it was a good idea. Most businesses let you adjust course within a season. This one asks you to commit to a decade-long forecast and then just wait. Once the trees finally reach maturity, the money doesn't come in one lump. It comes in layers, stacked on top of each other, and the gap between the bottom layer and the top layer is where all the real profit, or the lack of it, actually lives. Layer 1. Wholesale, the floor of the business. This is the layer that most growers, especially the big ones, actually live on. You cut the tree, bale it, load it onto a truck, and sell it in bulk to a lot, a retailer or a distributor. The problem is that wholesale is a break-even game dressed up as a business. One widely used industry breakdown puts total production and fixed costs at around $18 to $330 per acre over a 9-year cycle, spread across roughly 900 trees, which works out to a break-even price of about $20 a tree. Sell at that price, and you've covered your costs and made nothing. Sell at a typical retail price of $50, and you've cleared about $30 in profit per tree. That's the entire wholesale business in one sentence. The difference between $20 and $50, multiplied by however many trees you can load onto a truck. And even that math is optimistic. Zoom out to the actual after-everything margin farmers report once labor, land, and the years of carrying costs are baked in, and the real number tends to land closer to a 25% to 30% profit margin. Roughly $8 to $10 of profit per tree once you account for the full 8 to 10 year growing cycle. That's not a rounding error. That's the gap between the number that looks good in a pitch deck and the number that shows up in a grower's bank account. Layer 2. U-cut, the retail escape hatch. This is where a grower stops being a commodity supplier and starts being a destination. Instead of trucking trees to a lot in another state, you let families drive out, wander the rows, and cut their own. Roughly a third of all Christmas tree sales in the U.S. happen this way, with wholesale making up the rest. The appeal for the grower is obvious. You skip the trucking, skip the middleman, and capture the full retail price yourself instead of settling for the wholesale floor. A tree that would have fetched $20 wholesale can sell for $60, $80, sometimes more, walked out the front gate by the same family that cut it. Layer 3. Scale, and what an acre is actually worth. Individual tree margins only tell you so much. What actually matters for a working farm is what an acre generates once trees are mature and the operation is running at full capacity. And here the estimates vary by a lot, which tells you something on its own. One estimate puts a mature, well-run acre at $15,000 to $50,000 in annual returns. A separate model, built around cultivated acreage rather than total planted land, puts the number at $42,000 to $49,000 per cultivated acre in revenue. With a footnote that matters more than the headline number. That figure counts cultivated acres, not total acres. And true profit still depends on labor, overhead, replanting reserves, and whether the owner is paying themselves at all. Here's the contrast worth sitting with. Take a single acre, 1,500 trees, sold at $60 apiece. That's $90,000 in revenue against roughly $22,000 in production costs. A $68,000 profit on paper. Now picture that same acre, same trees, same labor, hitting the market in a glut year instead of a shortage year. We'll get to exactly how bad that can get in the next section, but the short version, the same 1,500 trees that clear $68,000 in a good year can, in a bad one, barely cover the cost of cutting them down. Layer 4. Everything that isn't the tree. This is the layer most people never think about, and it's often where the real margin hides. Wreaths, garland, tree stands, tabletop and potted trees, even scented pine cones. Farmers can add meaningfully to their season by selling wreaths and pre-cut arrangements alongside the trees, items that often carry a higher margin than the tree itself. None of this requires new acreage. It's the same land, the same trimmings, the same labor that's already on site during harvest season, repackaged into a second and third product line. Grow cycle layer 5. The experience economy. The most sophisticated operations have figured out that the tree is almost a loss leader for something bigger, the day itself. Hot cocoa stands, hay rides, photo backdrops, a Santa's workshop, a $15 entry fee just to walk the property before anyone's even picked a tree. This is the layer that turns a farm into a destination business, and it's the one that scales best against rising land costs because you're not selling more trees, you're selling more reasons to spend money while you're there. Putting the layers together. Line them up, and you can see why some growers barely survive, while others, on paper, look like they're printing money. A grower who only does wholesale, at scale, on rented land, is fighting for pennies above break-even. That $20 to $50 spread, times volume, minus everything that went wrong over the preceding decade. A grower who does U-cut, sells their own wreaths, runs a weekend hayride, and owns their land outright is capturing 4 or 5 margins on the same acre instead of one. And underneath every single one of these layers sits the same fact. None of this revenue exists until year 7, 8, 9, or 10. The wholesale grower and the diversified agritourism operator are both, right now, making a bet on what the market will look like a decade from now. They're just making very different-sized bets on how many ways they'll be able to monetize being right. Which raises the obvious question: what happens to all of these carefully stacked revenue layers when the bet turns out to be wrong? That's where this business stops looking like farming and starts looking like something closer to a slow-motion financial trap. Here's the mechanism that makes this business fundamentally different from almost any other kind of farming. And it comes down to one brutal fact. The decision and the consequence are separated by roughly a decade, and nothing you do in between can close that gap. Think about what a grower actually knows the day they plant a seedling. They know today's price. They know today's demand. They know whether trees are scarce or abundant right now. What they don't know, what nobody can know, is what the market will look like when that seedling is finally tall enough to sell, 8 to 10 years later. So growers do the only rational thing available to them. They plant based on the signal in front of them. If prices are high today, they plant more. If prices are low today, they plant less. And that's exactly where the trap springs shut, because by the time those decisions turn into actual trees on actual trucks, the signal they were responding to is 10 years stale. And every other grower in the country was reading that same stale signal and reacting the same way. This has a name in agricultural economics. It's called a cobweb cycle. And Christmas trees are one of the cleanest real-world examples of it in existence. Here's the domino chain, and it's already happened once, in full view, within living memory. In the 1990s, prices were good, so farmers planted too many trees. Nothing wrong with that decision at the time. It was the correct read of the market they were looking at. But a decade is a long time, and every other grower in the country made the same correct-at-the-time bet. So, by the early 2000s, all those trees hit maturity at once. The glut collapsed prices, and it put many farms out of business. A 6-foot wholesale tree that had sold for $22 to $26 in early 2000 was going for $14 to $16 a few years later. And in the worst pockets, growers were reportedly moving fields of trees for $1, even 50 cents apiece, just to clear the land. That's not a thin margin. That's a grower paying, in effect, to get rid of a decade of labor. Now watch the second domino fall, because this is the part that makes the trap self-perpetuating instead of self-correcting. Growers who survived the glut did the only thing that made sense given what they'd just lived through. They planted far less. The economic collapse of 2008 hit demand right as growers were already gun-shy, and it took years for that oversupply to work its way back into balance with demand, which meant even fewer new seedlings went into the ground. One longtime grower put it plainly. They simply didn't have the money to buy seedlings and replant during the recession. Fast forward the requisite 8 to 10 years, and the second half of the domino chain lands exactly on schedule. The trees that should have been planted around 2008 to 2010 were never planted, or were planted in far smaller numbers, and the shortage that caused wasn't felt in the market until nearly a decade later. One Manhattan tree seller who'd run the same lot for 36 years watched a wholesale 4-foot tree that cost him $24 climb to $60, and he said he saw it coming years in advance because he understood the planting rhythm of the crop. Prices didn't spike because of weather or fuel costs or a bad harvest. They spiked because of a planting decision made by people reacting to a financial crisis a full decade earlier. Read that again. A 2-year recession in 2008 produced a Christmas tree shortage that was still working its way through the market in the 2020s. That's the trap. It isn't that growers make bad decisions. It's that even a perfectly rational decision, made on the best information available at the time, gets validated or destroyed by a market that won't exist for another 10 years. And by the time you find out which one happened, you've already made the next decade's decision too. If you want to see how this cycle actually plays out on the ground, there are two threads worth following. One about who ends up owning this business, and one about exactly what the price swings looked like to someone standing in the middle of them. The corporate thread, Crown Zellerbach, and the rise of Noble Mountain. For most of the industry's history, this was a family business. Small landowners, a few dozen acres, trees as a side income alongside other farming. That started to change at the end of the 1960s, when Crown Zellerbach, a large timberland company, decided to enter the Christmas tree business, planting noble fir across more than 1,000 acres in the hills near Salem, Oregon. Up to that point, the industry was made up almost entirely of family operations and small landowners running dozens of scattered farms. Crown Zellerbach was the first large corporate entrant into that world. That single decision by a timber company, made in the late 1960s, eventually became Noble Mountain, which traces its roots directly back to that Crown Zellerbach planting and has grown into one of the nation's largest Christmas tree producers, spanning roughly 5 million trees across 4,000 acres in Oregon's Willamette Valley. A single corporate bet on land that used to belong to family farms is now one of the operations big enough to survive a decade-long bust cycle that wipes out smaller growers every time it hits. Scale, it turns out, is one of the only real defenses against a market. This slow-moving, a family with 40 acres, can be destroyed by a glut that a 4,000-acre operation can absorb. The price thread, what the cobweb cycle actually looked like in dollars. Go back to the early 2000s glut described in the last section, and the numbers get almost absurd. One industry figure described a 6-foot wholesale tree that sold for $22 to $26 in early 2000, falling to $14 to $16 just a few years later. And he said he'd personally heard of entire fields of trees going for as little as 50 cents to $1 apiece, cut, baled, and shipped, just to get something back for the land. Picture that for a second. A tree that took 8 years to grow, that cost real money in seedlings, fertilizer, and labor every single one of those years, sold for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Now jump forward to the other side of the cycle and watch the same math run in reverse. Scott Lechner, who managed Soho trees in Manhattan for 36 years, watched a wholesale 4-foot tree that cost him $24 around 2010 or 2011 climb to $60 by 2017, a 2.5 times increase on the exact same product, with no change in quality, driven entirely by a planting decision made almost a decade earlier. Lechner said he saw the shortage coming years in advance, precisely because he understood how the recession had gutted new planting. He described stockpiling his best growers like Noah's Ark, because he knew the shortage was coming and he could do nothing to speed up a tree that takes a decade to grow. Line the two moments up, and the shape of the trap becomes impossible to miss. 50 cents a tree in the early 2000s, $60 a tree by 2017. Same industry, same basic product, separated by less than 2 decades. And both extremes traced back to a planting decision made in direct response to whatever the market looked like 10 years before either number showed up. Nobody in this business gets to react to the present. Everyone is permanently trading on a forecast of a decade from now, and the price you eventually get is really just a grade on how good that forecast turned out to be. So what does this actually mean for the person standing at the edge of a field, deciding whether to put seedlings in the ground? The best case looks like Noble Mountain. You start big enough or grow patient enough across generations to absorb the bad decade instead of being destroyed by it. You diversify across wholesale, you-cut, wreaths, and the experience economy, so no single revenue layer has to carry the whole operation. And when the cobweb cycle inevitably turns against you, because it will, it always does, you've got the scale and the reserves to simply wait it out, planting through the bust instead of retreating from it, so that you're one of the operations still standing when the shortage arrives and the prices triple. The worst case looks like every anonymous grower behind that 50 cents a tree statistic. A family that planted at exactly the wrong moment, not because they were careless, but because they made the same rational bet everyone else was making at the time. 10 years later, the trap springs shut, and there's no adjusting course. The trees are already in the ground, already 8 years into a cycle you can't speed up, already answering a question about a market that no longer exists. You don't find out you lost until it's far too late to have played it differently. And that's really the thing worth sitting with here. This industry looks like farming, gets talked about like farming, and shows up in the same government statistics as farming. But underneath it, a Christmas tree farm is one of the purest forecasting businesses in America. You're not really growing a tree. You're placing a bet on what the country will want and be willing to pay for in a year you can currently only guess at, and the seedling you plant today is really just a wager on a future you'll spend the next decade unable to change your mind about.